I remember hearing someone saying that the 50s was the most conservative period and bad for writers. It was Carl Stead. He wasn't very old in the 1950s, but there was another side to that. Although it's always described as being conservative, it had part of an old New Zealand tradition. That is, you always had a left and a right. You know, ever from the days of the Treaty of Waitangi, you see. And this is not generally understood. Mind you, modern New Zealand history is bloody pathetic, the way it's not portrayed amongst people anyway. But this characteristic of New Zealand, where you had people struggling in this direction and people holding it back in that direction, you'll find it's quite clear. That still prevailed. And so the context of the 51 dispute can only be put in that context. Otherwise, it seems to be peculiar, and it's often written up about individuals in the leadership. But those individuals, on both sides, came from their own historical backgrounds. And unless people understand that things don't come out of thin air when it comes to that sort of history, they have a background. And as far as 51 is concerned, as that is the dispute, for years in the post-war period, after the chaps came back from the war, many of whom went on the wharf, you know, or some of those people had been in World War I, there'd been the struggle going on for decent wages, you know, post-war they came back and all that sort of thing. And under those conditions, you still had this left-right sort of clash, not necessarily left or right totally understood like that, but that was the basis, which you can say it's got a historical background. On top of that, we had all that time from about 1945, maybe before then, certainly up to 1951, there was an almost hysterical attack on the Waterfront Workers' Union. And part of it was, there was a cartoonist, for example, in the Herald called Mahinik, and he had the most appallingly vicious cartoons about wharfies. It was constant. And this was also happening at the same time as the anti-communist hysteria, the Cold War. The American sort of sponsored stuff was starting at the same time. Terrible things were happening. But there was great struggles happening around the world too. Like, for example, in Queensland, at the same time, you had the coal miners went on strike. It was a very heroic thing, you know, it was massive. In Canada, on the west coast, seamen went on strike all around the world. They were ending up in jails in places like South Africa and goodness knows what, and they were here in Auckland. This was a sort of a worldwide trend of struggle, you know, industrial struggle. The waterfront work struggle was in that context. There were some very good unions around the world, and there was a lot of solidarity, if you can use a word like that, there had been a traditional connection between the New Zealand waterfront, the Sydney and Melbourne waterfront, and San Francisco waterfront. You wouldn't think about that now, but I mean that'd been going on from the 19th century right through to this time. There was always a financial support from workers' unions, and in Australia, for example, when they were needed in New Zealand, or vice versa. This was quite common. And there was a sense of solidarity, and when for example, the waterfront dispute was on, there was a tremendous amount of support. And you'll find, for example, that unions, like the freezing workers, the seamen and others, no matter what their leaderships were like, they joined this. They boycotted certain things, they got involved. The coal miners, all those sort of industrial unions, despite the opposition from people like Finton, Patrick, Walsh and people like that. And this was in the framework of a very nasty government. It became very right-wing and led by a man called Sid Holland. But their main beneficiaries of this action were the English shipping owners. In those days, the gigantic English monopolies carted New Zealand produce, you see. And they were very annoyed at the way the Waterfront Workers Union, but the reason that there was local support from the right-wingers or the business people for crushing the old wharfies was it was the leading force for keeping the wages struggle alive. You know, the carpenters were had been before that, but that was in the craft unions. So there was the two sort of things, and they had to smash them. That was the attitude of the bosses. And the beneficiaries initially would be these big shipping companies. Ironically, they're no longer in existence in this meat trade, but anyway, that's what they were like. And it was in that atmosphere that, first of all, you had this sort of anti-communist, it was quite hysterical, bursting out all over the place. You had this tradition of very strong opposition to unions. On the other hand, you had the unions in very strong opposition to the people opposed to the unions, you know, that was the atmosphere. In the case of the wharfies, as it was with the carpenters a couple of years before, it was a lockout. The workers, the wharfies, same with the carpenters, taken action about some issue, whatever it was. Might have been one of the conditions, or it might have been a wage thing, but I'm not sure it was a wage thing anyway. But once again, you'll have to take a note of that and ask Dick Scott. But anyway, so they had some sort of a struggle which would probably slowed the wharf up or something like that, you know. There would be an interruption. But it wasn't a strike, and they got locked out. They brought in this state of emergency, locked the wharfies out, drove them off the waterfront, you see. They had been working, but then they were off. Now that was it. But on the other hand, the other trade unions that supported them, the workers in the other parts of the country, what the situation with Wellington was be similar to what I've described, but in other parts, the miners and others, they went on strike. So there was two things. They went on strike in support of the waterfront, and largely in opposition to the state of emergency.